I'd say 100% I'm not considered a suspect at this point. No, I didn't have any drugs, and Major Crimes knows that, or they would have, charged me with possession of drugs or drug paraphernalia. There was nothing at the house, so, and they know that.
A newly released interview with Daniel Martell, published by CBC News Nova Scotia, has drawn significant attention from the media and from those closely following the disappearance of Lilly Sullivan and Jack Sullivan. The timing of this interview is particularly notable. It was released shortly after Daniel Martell was arrested on an unrelated criminal charge, raising renewed public interest and scrutiny around his past statements and actions. In this interview, Martell shares several details that had not been publicly discussed before, including his voluntary DNA submission, his repeated offers to hand over his phone to investigators, and his account of events surrounding the day Malehya left the home following the children's disappearance. These disclosures are being viewed by many as potentially significant elements in the broader timeline of the case.
Still searching every day. I'm waiting for information. I have to let them do a lot of their stuff with the aircrafts and everything else, and dogs and searchers. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be coordinated, and I can't just go.
At the same time, they raise new questions about what was known, what was shared publicly, and how these statements align with the ongoing investigation. In this video, we will carefully analyze the interview, break down the key claims made by Daniel Martell, and examine the areas that stand out or warrant closer attention, while remaining focused on verified information and avoiding speculation. Don't forget to subscribe to True Child Cases for the latest updates and in-depth, responsible analysis of this case. Now, let's begin with the first critical set of facts. Total cooperation with police. How real is it, and what does it signal? In this interview, Daniel Martell repeatedly frames himself as someone who has been fully open with investigators from the beginning.
Cooperative. Just like in the past, I keep asking them, do you want my phone? Do you want me to do more polygraphs? Like I'm open to everything. And I always tell them that. They say, Daniel, no, we don't need your phone. Daniel, no, it's not necessary to do any more polygraphs. So at this point, I'm very cooperative, And when they did up the paper for consent on my DNA, they fill in the paper, May 2nd, missing persons case for Jack and Lilly.
He uses the same theme again and again. I'm cooperative, and he supports that theme with 3 specific claims. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample. He offered his phone, and he says he was willing to do additional polygraph testing. On the surface, that sounds straightforward. But when you listen closely to how he explains it and what he doesn't explain, this total cooperation narrative becomes something we can analyze more carefully. A key point here is not whether cooperation happened at all. The interview strongly suggests it did. The real question is, what kind of cooperation is being described? How is it being presented? And what does that presentation achieve, especially in a high-attention missing children case? Why I cooperated becomes a central strategy in high-profile cases. When a case involves missing children, the public environment becomes intense very quickly. People want answers, and emotions run high. In that kind of climate, anyone close to the case, especially a parent figure, will face public suspicion whether fair or not. So, saying, I cooperated, functions as more than a factual statement. It becomes a message to the audience. I have nothing to hide. The police are satisfied with me. I'm being transparent, even if others are accusing me. Martell doesn't just mention cooperation once. He returns to it repeatedly, and he adds strong words like 100% voluntary and I'm open to everything. In communication terms, this is a classic attempt to build a consistent identity, the cooperative, reasonable, helpful figure. Whether that identity matches reality is a separate issue, but as a storytelling frame, it's clear and deliberate. B. The DNA sample. What he emphasizes and why the details matter. Martell describes giving a DNA sample and does something very noticeable. He spends time on process-level detail. He explains where it happened, at the station, who did it, an investigator, and even the method. A finger prick, squeezing for a long time, drops onto a pad, sealed into an envelope and bag is evidence. This level of detail is unusual for casual conversation. So why do it? 1. Procedural detail creates the feeling of truth. When someone describes a process in concrete steps, audiences often interpret it as credibility. It sounds like, how could he be making this up if he knows the steps?
Awesome kids, very, very kind. They'll talk to anyone. They want to go with anyone. They're just looking to have as much fun as they can. Jack just absolutely loves bugs, dinosaurs, and anything like that. But Lily loves girly things, but she also loves doing everything with Jack, bugs. They're like best friends, not just brother and sister.
But there's an important logic check. Knowing procedure doesn't prove innocence. It mainly proves he's been through a procedure, or wants you to believe he has. What's interesting is that the details he chooses are not emotionally focused. I was shaken, I was worried, etc. Instead, he focuses on the mechanics, the tool, the time, the sealing process. That style can serve a purpose. It keeps the story anchored in official-looking reality. It places him inside the structure of formal investigation, which indirectly suggests legitimacy. 2. He uses DNA to normalize expected traces. He says his DNA would obviously be on a blanket. That is a smart rhetorical move, because it frames the situation as normal. If he lived in the home, contact traces might be expected on shared items. This line does two things at once. It anticipates suspicion. Why would his DNA be there? It answers the suspicion before it fully forms, because of normal contact. Again, it doesn't resolve anything by itself. It's simply a preemptive explanation, designed to reduce the impact of the DNA topic. 3. The blanket becomes a controlled mystery. He also says he can't disclose much and is limited on what he knows about the blanket. That creates a tight balance. He reveals just enough to sound informed and involved. He holds back enough to avoid being pinned down on specifics. This is important because controlled disclosure can protect a speaker from contradictions later. If you never give details about where something was found or when it surfaced, the audience can't compare your statement to other timelines. The result is a narrative that feels informative but remains difficult to verify. C. I offered my phone. The cooperation claim that's powerful but hard to prove. Martell says he kept asking investigators if they wanted his phone, and they repeatedly told him no. That statement is extremely useful to him publicly because it implies he was willing to surrender a highly personal item. Police did not feel it was necessary. Therefore, he wants the audience to infer he wasn't under serious suspicion. But there's a logical gap here. In real investigations, the decision to take a phone depends on many factors. What police already have, what legal thresholds apply, whether data can be obtained through other routes, and investigative priorities at the time. So even if his statement is true, they didn't take my phone does not automatically mean they cleared me. It can mean many things. It can also reflect investigative strategy, timing, or legal process. The key analytical point. Martell uses the phone offer not as a neutral fact, but as evidence of his own openness. It's part of a package. DNA plus phone plus polygraph equals I did everything. The audience is meant to see a pattern of willingness. Whether police response confirms that pattern is not something we can verify from this interview alone. D. The polygraph. When he turns a test into a public clearance, Martell states that during the polygraph process, Questions focused on fatal outcomes rather than disappearance scenarios, and he says the results showed he was truthful. He also suggests that because he wasn't asked certain kinds of questions, that implies he wasn't involved in other possibilities. This is where the logic gets shaky. 1. A polygraph is not a definitive public clearance. Even when a polygraph is mentioned, it does not function like a court verdict. People often treat it as a scoreboard: pass equals innocent, fail equals guilty, but it doesn't work that way. From a responsible analysis standpoint, it's more accurate to say, a polygraph can reflect how a person responded in that setting. It does not establish full truth about a complex event. It does not confirm the full scope of what someone may or may not know. Martell, however, frames it as a strong validation. In communication terms, he's converting a complex, limited tool into a simple conclusion the public can understand. 2. That they didn't ask me about X argument is not logically strong. His reasoning goes like this. If investigators didn't ask questions about certain scenarios, it means those scenarios weren't relevant to him. But investigators choose questions for many reasons. Sometimes they focus on what they can reliably test in that moment. Sometimes they avoid certain topics for strategic reasons. And sometimes they are simply narrowing scope. So the absence of a question is not proof of absence of involvement. It's just absence of a question. 3. I'm open to more polygraphs becomes a reputational shield. Even offering more polygraphs is, in this context, more about image than evidence. If he says, I offered more, they said no, that again implies the police did not need further verification. The audience is being nudged toward a conclusion. If police didn't push harder, he must be fine. That's a persuasive narrative, but it's still a narrative. E. The consent form and the no criminal involvement box, a high-impact moment. Martell describes a form where a box was checked indicating no criminal involvement, and he says seeing that made him very happy. This is one of the most attention-grabbing parts of the interview, because it sounds like an official statement. But we have to handle it carefully. 1. Forms can reflect context, not final conclusions. A checkbox on a consent form may reflect the situation at the time of signing or the administrative category of the request. It may not be a permanent classification. It also may not be a comprehensive statement about a person's status in the broader case. 2. He uses visual proof language to strengthen it. He emphasizes he saw it with his own
Martell
eyes,
said he also asked for a
which is a
polygraph
classic
test.
way to turn a claim into something that feels undeniable. The emotional impact is clear. He wants the audience to feel that authorities themselves labeled him as not involved. From a logic standpoint, we should treat it as a reported detail from Martell, without independent verification in the interview itself, and with possible limitations in meaning. Still, it is absolutely a key moment to highlight, because it's the closest thing in his account to an official-looking clearance, at least in the way he presents it. F. I'm cooperative versus I can't talk about that. The tension that stands out. A subtle but important analytical observation is that Martell's cooperation narrative is strongest where it benefits him. DNA, phone, polygraph. But when the conversation approaches more sensitive interpersonal areas, especially anything involving relationships, he becomes more guarded. In the transcript, he signals boundaries around discussing Malehya or the relationship dynamic. This creates a tension the audience will notice. On one hand, I'm open to everything. On the other hand, I don't want to talk about that. That doesn't prove wrongdoing. People avoid discussing private relationships for many reasons. But from a narrative analysis point of view, it matters because it shows cooperation is selectively emphasized, not necessarily as a full life principle, but as a case-specific defense posture. G. What this segment adds to the bigger picture. So what can we responsibly conclude from this section of the interview? Martell is very intentionally presenting himself as fully cooperative. He uses procedural detail, DNA collection steps, to create credibility and officialness. He frames police decisions, "They didn't take my phone, they didn't want more polygraphs," as indirect proof that he is not under suspicion. Some of his reasoning, especially about what investigators did not ask, does not logically prove what he suggests it proves. The strongest moment for his public image is the consent form checkbox story, but its meaning may be narrower than he implies. The key takeaway for analysis is this: the interview is not just an update, it is a carefully constructed self-portrait. In a case with high public pressure, that kind of self-portrait can shape discussion as much as facts do. The job of responsible coverage is to separate what he claims happened, what those claims logically imply, and what they don't, and what remains unknown. DNA details and the blanket, concrete evidence, or a carefully managed gap.
And, they got a few drops in my blood for that, to check my DNA, because my DNA is obviously going to be on the blanket. But I can't really disclose, and I'm pretty limited on what I know about the blanket at this moment.
One of the most revealing parts of Daniel Martell's interview is also one of the most frustrating, because it involves something that sounds like physical evidence, but is discussed in a way that leaves major blanks. Martell acknowledges that investigators collected his DNA and that his DNA would obviously be on a blanket connected to the case. Yet he does not say where that blanket came from, how it entered the investigation, or what exactly prompted this step at this stage. That combination, a real object, is mentioned, but the context is missing, is exactly the kind of segment that deserves careful, logical analysis. This is not about jumping to conclusions. It's about understanding how a speaker can present a detail that sounds important while controlling what the audience can actually verify. When you focus only on what is said, it seems like a routine update. When you focus on what is not said, the blanket becomes a key point of tension. A. Why the blanket matters more than almost anything else in the interview. In missing child cases, public updates are often vague. Search efforts continue. Tips are being followed. No new information to release. That's why the blanket stands out. It is not a general statement. It is a specific item. A real object implies the existence of a trail that can be tested, potential contact history, potential location relevance, and possible movement or discovery events. When Martell says his DNA is obviously going to be on the blanket, he is indirectly confirming something significant. Investigators are treating this object as relevant enough to justify formal collection and evidence handling. Even without official confirmation, the way he describes it suggests the blanket is not a random household item being discussed casually. In his own words, it is connected to a formal process with sealed evidence packaging. That's why this moment becomes a key point for analysis. This is a rare moment when the interview touches on something concrete, something that's not just an opinion or theory. B. The two messages he sends at once, "I know" and "I can't say." Martell presents a careful balance. He signals that he knows something about this blanket, but then he repeatedly limits the details. He says he can't disclose much and that he is limited in what he knows at this moment. That choice of wording is important. It does three things at the same time. It makes him appear connected to the official process. He is not speaking as an outsider. He is speaking as someone who has been contacted by investigators about a specific item. It protects him from being pinned down. If he doesn't share where it was found or how it was located, he cannot be contradicted later by a timeline or new reporting. It hints at something serious without committing to it. The audience is left thinking, if a blanket is part of evidence, something meaningful must have happened. But because details are absent, that meaning remains a question mark. This is a classic communication pattern in high scrutiny situations. Reveal a real object to sound credible. Then keep the key context vague to remain safe from factual traps. C. My DNA would obviously be on it. Normalization as early defense. The line about DNA being obviously on the blanket is not a neutral statement. It functions as an early defense move. It pre-answers a suspicion that viewers might have. When someone says, my DNA would obviously be there, they are implying, don't treat my DNA as suspicious. Contact traces are expected. This is consistent with normal household life. In a case involving missing children, viewers often focus heavily on forensic-sounding details, DNA, objects, searches, evidence bags, and so on. Martell seems aware of that. So he takes control of how the audience should interpret the DNA result before any result is even discussed. That is the important logical point. He isn't reacting to a DNA outcome. He is shaping interpretation ahead of time. Even if his explanation is reasonable, the timing of the explanation matters. It signals that he anticipates public suspicion and wants to neutralize it early. D. What's missing? If 3 context questions the interview doesn't answer. If you're analyzing this interview responsibly, you can point out the missing context without making accusations. There are 3 basic questions any viewer would naturally ask. 1. Where did the blanket come from? Martell never says. Was it from the home? Found outdoors? Recovered during a search? Connected to a reported sighting? The source changes the meaning completely. A blanket found in the home might mean one thing. A blanket recovered from another location might mean something very different. Without the where, the audience cannot draw stable conclusions. 2. Why now? Martell describes this as happening months into the case. If this interview is around the 8-month mark, the question becomes, why is DNA being collected related to this item at this stage? It could be routine, it could be a delayed step, or it could be linked to a new development. The interview doesn't clarify. 3. What exactly did investigators ask him about the blanket? He calls the later formal interview about the blanket not very long, around 20 minutes. But what were the questions? Were they confirming ownership, usage, timeline, movement? Again, no specifics. The result is that viewers are presented with a high-value object, but given low-value context. That's why this segment is so useful for analysis. It's a perfect example of a detail that sounds like evidence, but is narratively controlled. E. The evidence handling description. Why he mentions sealing and packaging. Martell describes the sample being sealed into an envelope, then into a plastic bag, then sealed as evidence. That description adds an official weight to his story. But the key analytical question is, why does he choose to emphasize that? Because for the public, sealed evidence signals legitimacy. It creates the feeling that everything is being done properly. Procedures are being followed, and therefore, the speaker is participating in a serious professional process. It's similar to how someone might mention, I signed the consent form, or it was recorded on the record. These details are less about what happened and more about how official it sounds. In other words, the audience may not understand forensic procedure, but they understand evidence bag language. Martell is speaking in that language. That doesn't mean he's lying. It means he knows which details build credibility in a public interview. F. I can't disclose versus I don't know. A subtle but important difference. Martell says he can't disclose much and is limited on what he knows about the blanket. At this moment, this is not the same as saying, I have no idea. It suggests either he has been told certain things but cannot share, or he wants to appear restricted as part of the process, or he is choosing caution to avoid any statement that could be compared against official timelines. This matters because it shapes how the audience sees him. If he says, I don't know, he seems uninvolved. If he says, I can't disclose. He seems involved, but responsible. That second image is often more useful to a person defending their reputation because it creates an impression of insider proximity without having to provide testable facts. So even his limitation statement functions in two directions. It prevents verification, while still preserving the image of cooperative involvement. G. The blanket as a narrative anchor. Why it can drive public attention. From a content perspective, the blanket is the most anchor-like item in the interview. It is something people can imagine, a real object connected to missing children. That makes it emotionally powerful. It also becomes a magnet for online theories. But here is the key. Because context is missing, the blanket is also a perfect object for speculation. Different communities will fill the gaps with their own assumptions. And Martell's phrasing, "I can't disclose," can unintentionally fuel that, because it invites the viewer to think there is more behind the scenes. A responsible analysis video can do something valuable here. It can slow the audience down and say, "We have a claim about a blanket. We have a claim that his DNA would be expected on it. We do not have confirmed details about origin, location, or timeline. Therefore, we can't assign meaning beyond what was said." That approach keeps your channel credible and avoids turning unknowns into conclusions. H. What we can responsibly extract from this segment. Based strictly on Martell's words in the interview, here are the strongest, grounded points. A blanket connected to the case was discussed in a formal context. Investigators collected Martell's DNA in a formal way. Martell asserts his DNA on the blanket would be normal and expected. Martell does not provide the blanket's origin or circumstances. The lack of context makes this item significant, but not interpretable on its own. That last point is the heart of the analysis. The blanket is big, but the interview keeps it intentionally unresolved. The key question for viewers. What is this segment trying to achieve? When you look at the blanket section as part of Martell's overall narrative, it fits into a pattern. He emphasizes cooperation. He emphasizes procedure. He emphasizes normal explanations for potentially suspicious details. He avoids specifics that could be checked or challenged. So the blanket segment functions as both. A credibility boost. There is real evidence and I'm involved in the process. And a safety shield. I won't say anything that could create contradictions. That doesn't prove anything about the case. But it does tell us how Martell is managing his public image in a moment when public pressure is intense. And that is exactly what your analysis can highlight. Not guesses, not accusations, just careful breakdown of the claims, the missing context, and the logic of the storytelling. The polygraph and the no criminal involvement box. Personal reassurance or subjective interpretation? In this part of the interview, Daniel Martell presents what he appears to consider one of the strongest confirmations of his position in the case. A consent form with a box checked indicating no criminal involvement, combined with his interpretation of the polygraph process. His tone noticeably shifts here. Unlike other parts of the interview, where he sounds explanatory or defensive, this section carries a sense of confidence and relief. He explicitly says seeing that box checked made him very happy, and he frames it as visual confirmation of what he believed from the start. This moment deserves careful analysis, not because it proves anything on its own, but because it shows how Daniel understands, interprets, and communicates investigative procedures to the public. The emotional weight of the checked box. Daniel describes the consent form in detail. Investigators filled it out, checked a box indicating no criminal involvement, and then presented it to him for his signature. He emphasizes not just the wording, but the experience of seeing it with his own eyes. That visual element matters. In public-facing narratives, seeing it written down often feels more authoritative than hearing it said aloud. From Daniel's perspective, This moment appears to function as validation. It aligns with his repeated claim that he has known from the beginning that he was not involved. The form becomes, in his telling, confirmation from investigators themselves, not just reassurance, but something close to official acknowledgement. However, from an analytical standpoint, it's important to separate what the form may represent procedurally from how Daniel interprets it personally. Administrative language versus investigative conclusions. Consent forms are administrative documents. Their primary purpose is to document permission, scope, and context for a specific action, in this case, DNA collection. A checkbox indicating no criminal involvement may reflect how the request is categorized at that moment, not a final or comprehensive determination about a person's role in an entire case. Investigations evolve. Classifications can change as information develops. A form used for one procedure does not function as a permanent status label. Yet, in the interview, Daniel treats that checkbox as something broader, a meaningful statement about how investigators view him overall. This difference between administrative classification and investigative conclusion is where interpretation begins to drift. The interview does not provide independent confirmation of what the checkbox legally or procedurally signifies. All we have is Daniel's understanding of it, presented with certainty. The polygraph. How Daniel frames its significance. Daniel explains that he underwent a polygraph and that the questions focused on fatal outcomes rather than on disappearance or removal scenarios. He states that investigators concluded he was truthful in his answers. From there, he builds a larger conclusion that because he was not asked about disappearance-related actions, and because he was found truthful on the questions asked, he had nothing to do with what happened. This reasoning is understandable on a human level. When someone goes through a stressful evaluation and is told they were truthful, relief and confidence often follow. But when examined logically, the reasoning becomes less solid. Polygraph examinations are limited tools. They are structured around specific questions, at specific times, under specific conditions. They do not test every possibility, nor do they map out every aspect of a complex event. Importantly, they are not designed to answer unasked questions. The core logical gap. Absence of a question is not evidence of absence. Daniel's argument hinges on a critical assumption. If investigators did not ask him about the disappearance itself, then that topic must not apply to him. This is where the logic weakens. There are many reasons investigators might limit the scope of polygraph questions. They may focus on areas they believe are most testable at that stage. They may already have other information guiding their strategy. They may avoid broader or ambiguous questions for technical reasons. Or they may reserve certain topics for later phases of an investigation. Because of this, the lack of a question does not automatically imply exclusion. It simply means that particular topic was not part of that specific examination. Daniel's interpretation turns a procedural choice into a conclusion, which is a logical leap rather than a demonstrated fact. They didn't ask as a reassurance narrative. In the interview, Daniel uses the phrase, "they didn't ask," almost as evidence in itself. He connects multiple elements together. They didn't ask about disappearance. They didn't need more polygraphs. They didn't take his phone. They checked the no criminal involvement box. When combined, these points form a reassuring narrative. If investigators truly had concerns, they would have pushed harder. Since they didn't, he reasons, there must be no concern. The problem with this reasoning is that it assumes investigative intensity always appears outwardly and immediately. In reality, investigative approaches are often quiet, selective, and staged. Decisions not to act in one way do not necessarily mean decisions to rule someone out entirely. Personal certainty versus institutional ambiguity. Another important aspect of this segment is the contrast between Daniel's certainty and the inherent ambiguity of investigative processes. He speaks with confidence, often using definitive language. 100%. I know. I've known since the start. That certainty may reflect his internal belief, but institutions like law enforcement rarely communicate in absolutes during active cases. The interview shows Daniel translating institutional silence or limited communication into personal reassurance. Where investigators may be neutral or non-committal, Daniel reads confirmation. This is not unusual in high-pressure situations, but it is analytically important. What we are seeing is not just information being shared, but meaning being assigned. Why this segment is so influential publicly? For viewers, the polygraph and checkbox section feels powerful because it sounds procedural and official. Forms, tests, and checked boxes carry symbolic weight. They feel objective. That's why this part of the interview can strongly shape public opinion. But symbolic weight is not the same as evidentiary value. The interview does not show the form. It does not explain the criteria behind the checkbox. It does not clarify the scope or limitations of the polygraph. Everything is filtered through Daniel's description and interpretation. That doesn't make his account false, but it does mean it cannot stand alone as confirmation of broader conclusions. What can be reasonably taken from this section? Sticking strictly to the interview content, without speculation, a responsible summary would be: Daniel signed a consent form related to DNA collection. That form included a checkbox labeled "No criminal involvement," which was checked at the time. Daniel underwent a polygraph focused on specific questions. He was told he was truthful in his responses to those questions. Daniel interprets these facts as confirmation that he is not involved. The final point is the most important distinction. It is his interpretation. The interview does not establish that investigators formally cleared him, ruled him out permanently, or excluded him from all aspects of the case. Why this matters for the larger analysis? This segment reveals something critical about how Daniel approaches the case publicly. He takes partial procedural elements and assembles them into a complete narrative of exclusion. That narrative may feel convincing, especially to viewers looking for clarity, but it rests on assumptions rather than explicit confirmations. For analysis purposes, this section is less about the polygraph itself and more about how meaning is constructed, how administrative language becomes reassurance, how limited questioning becomes inferred exclusion, and how personal certainty fills gaps left by official silence. Understanding that distinction helps viewers stay grounded. It allows them to recognize confidence without mistaking it for proof, and explanation without mistaking it for resolution. In a case where so much remains unknown, that kind of clarity about what something means and what it does not mean is essential. I believe it's criminal, but it can't become criminal until there's a suspect, a position that shapes the whole narrative. In the interview, Daniel Martell makes a clear statement that many viewers immediately lock onto. He says he believes the children's disappearance is criminal in nature. He does not present it as a vague possibility. He answers directly, yes, when asked whether he thinks it is criminal. Then he adds a second point that sounds procedural and informed, that the case will not pivot from a missing person investigation to a criminal investigation until investigators have a suspect and formal steps follow. At first glance, this sounds like a careful, practical explanation of how investigations work. It also aligns with what the public generally understands about law enforcement processes. But when you analyze how this idea functions inside Daniel's overall interview message, it becomes more than a procedural comment. It becomes a strategic framing tool, one that can influence how the audience interprets the case, who they focus on, and how they interpret the lack of public updates. This section is a key reason public opinion becomes divided, because it allows two very different readings at the same time. Why saying it's criminal is a high-impact choice. In missing person cases, there are typically multiple broad possibilities that the public discusses: accident, misadventure, voluntary absence, or third-party involvement. When Daniel chooses the criminal label, he is doing something significant. He is narrowing the public imagination toward one direction, outside involvement, and away from other possibilities. Even if he genuinely believes it, the impact is the same. It frames the situation as something that likely involves another person's intent and action. This matters because Daniel is not a distant commentator. He is a central figure connected to the household and the timeline. When he uses the criminal frame, it carries extra weight with viewers because they assume he has insider proximity to the situation, conversations with investigators, and knowledge the public does not have. That's why this section becomes such a magnet for attention. People ask, why is he so sure? And what does he know that we don't? The second claim, it won't pivot until there's a suspect. Daniel's follow-up statement is the part that sounds most official. He suggests the case cannot truly become a criminal case until investigators have a suspect, and then steps follow that lead toward formal action. Whether or not his wording is technically precise, the broader idea is familiar to audiences. Law enforcement may keep details limited, and a case may remain publicly categorized as missing, even if investigators are exploring third-party involvement behind the scenes. From a communication standpoint, this is powerful because it creates an explanation for the public's biggest frustration: the lack of visible progress. If people ask, why haven't we heard more? Daniel's framework answers, because they can't shift publicly until a suspect exists. This is important. He offers the audience a story that makes the silence feel meaningful rather than empty. How this helps Daniel position himself outside suspicion. Now we get to the core analytical point. This criminal, but not yet criminal framing, can function as a form of self-positioning. Daniel repeatedly presents himself as cooperative with investigators, willing to do whatever is asked, and confident he is not being treated as a suspect. When he says, I believe it's criminal, and then explains it won't pivot until there's a suspect, he subtly creates an implied structure. There is a criminal actor. Investigators are looking for that actor. The case will formally shift when that actor is identified. Where does Daniel sit inside that structure? By default, he places himself outside it. He does not say, they're looking at me. He does not say, I'm being investigated as that suspect. He positions the suspect as someone else, someone not yet identified. This can be persuasive to viewers because it matches his earlier points. They checked no criminal involvement. They didn't need my phone. They said no to more polygraphs. Whether or not those points mean what he says they mean, they combine with the criminal actor concept to create a consistent impression. Daniel is not the target. The target is a third party. That is why this segment can be viewed as reputation management, not necessarily fabrication, just framing. The invisible third person. A narrative that can't be tested. When Daniel implies criminal involvement, but does not provide any specifics, the who becomes a blank space. The suspect is essentially an invisible figure, and blank spaces are powerful because they invite viewers to fill them with whatever they already believe. Different audiences fill that blank differently. Some imagine a stranger. Some imagine someone in the wider community. Some imagine someone connected to the family. Some focus on rumors, online theories, or patterns they think they see. Daniel's statement does not create evidence. It creates a direction of attention. That direction can be intensely influential in a high-emotion case. It can also deepen division, because once people pick a direction, they interpret every detail through it. From an analysis perspective, the invisible third person is one of the most important narrative elements in the interview. It shifts the conversation away from what happened and toward who did it. even though the public does not have the information needed to answer that responsibly. The logic risk. Procedural truth used as a shield for interpretive leaps. Daniel's procedural explanation sounds reasonable, but there's a logic risk here. A statement can be broadly consistent with investigative reality while still being used to support conclusions that do not actually follow. For example, it may be true that investigators do not publicly label a case criminal without enough grounds. It may be true that details are kept limited. It may be true that formal steps require legal thresholds. But it does not automatically follow that. Investigators have no concerns about anyone close to the case. Investigators are definitely confident about third-party involvement, or that the suspect must be an unknown outsider. In other words, even if his process description is reasonable, the conclusions people may draw from it can go beyond what is actually supported. Daniel benefits from this ambiguity. He can suggest a criminal framing without naming anyone, without presenting verifiable specifics, and without committing to a timeline that could later be challenged. Why this section divides public opinion? This is one of the clearest split points in the interview, because viewers interpret it in opposite ways. Interpretation 1. He's being realistic and repeating what investigators would say. Some people hear Daniel's explanation and think it sounds informed. They conclude he's aligned with the investigation. He's careful not to overstate details. And he is simply describing why the case remains officially categorized as missing. To these viewers, his tone reads as cooperative and grounded. Interpretation 2. He's steering the narrative away from himself. Other people hear the same explanation and feel it functions like a redirect, placing the focus on a third party, framing the case as a criminal act without offering proof, and using procedural language to appear credible. To these viewers, it reads like a strategy, sound aligned with law enforcement while directing public suspicion elsewhere. The reason both interpretations persist is simple. The interview provides strong framing but limited verifiable context. The hope layer. Criminal framing without closing the door. Daniel also says he holds hope that the children could still be found safe, and that there is no reason not to. That matters because it softens the criminal framing. He is not presenting a single fixed outcome. He is presenting criminal involvement as his belief, but not presenting finality in public. This combination is emotionally effective. It reassures supportive viewers that he still believes in a positive outcome. It allows him to sound compassionate and persistent. It avoids committing to a definitive conclusion. From a narrative perspective, it's a strong combination. Seriousness plus hope. It plays well in public messaging. A responsible analytical takeaway. Staying strictly within the interview content, here is what can be responsibly said. Daniel states he believes the disappearance involves criminal involvement. He argues that a missing person case does not formally become a criminal investigation without a suspect and formal steps. This framing can explain the lack of public shifts, while suggesting investigators may be working behind the scenes. At the same time, the framing implicitly places attention on an unidentified third party, which can influence public interpretation and increase division. His reasoning can sound procedural and credible while still leaving large gaps that cannot be verified from the interview alone. The key point for viewers is that this segment is not just information. It is a way of organizing the entire story. A criminal actor exists, investigators are working quietly, and the case will shift when a suspect emerges. That story may be possible. It may also be incomplete. What the interview clearly shows is that Daniel wants the public to view the case through that lens. And in a high-profile missing children situation, the lens often matters as much as the facts, because the lens determines where the public looks, who the public questions, and which details become amplified online. Allegations of abuse, control, and the relationship with Malehya. denial, distance, and image management. This segment of the interview shifts the tone noticeably. After long stretches where Daniel Martell appears detailed, procedural, and eager to explain his cooperation with investigators, the conversation moves into a far more sensitive area. Allegations raised by people connected to Malehya regarding emotional abuse, control, and isolation. Daniel's response is immediate and firm. He denies all accusations. Yet just as quickly, he draws a boundary and refuses to discuss the relationship in depth. This contrast-clear denial paired with deliberate withdrawal is one of the most revealing communication moments in the interview. Not because it proves anything about the allegations themselves, but because it exposes how Daniel manages risk, narrative control, and public perception when the topic moves from procedure to personal dynamics. Clear, direct denials. What Daniel chooses to address. When confronted with claims that he was emotionally abusive, controlling, or isolating Malehya from her friends and family, Daniel responds with short, unequivocal denials. He does not hedge. He does not soften his language. He simply says no. He also adds a specific clarification regarding phone access, stating that both he and Malehya had access to each other's phones, shared passwords, and that blocking of contacts was mutual. This detail is important because it reframes the accusation. Instead of control flowing in one direction, he presents the situation as reciprocal. From a communication standpoint, this is a classic reframing technique. Take an allegation of imbalance and restate it as equality. At this stage, Daniel is still aligned with the transparent and cooperative image he has built earlier in the interview. He answers directly, stays calm, and provides just enough explanation to counter the claim without expanding the discussion further. The sudden boundary. I don't want to talk about that. What stands out is not only what Daniel denies, but what he declines to elaborate on next. When asked to describe the relationship before the children disappeared, he stops the conversation. He explicitly says he does not want to talk about the relationship and suggests it is best not to go further. This is a sharp contrast to his earlier openness. Up to this point, he has spoken at length about procedures, evidence handling, interviews, and interactions with investigators. Here, however, he draws a firm line. From a logical perspective, this moment does not confirm or disprove any allegation. But from a narrative analysis perspective, it matters because it breaks the pattern he has established. Viewers have been told repeatedly that he is open, cooperative, and willing to answer anything. Then suddenly, there is a subject that is off limits. That tension is subtle, but it is real. Why this topic carries higher risk than others? Relationship dynamics are fundamentally different from procedural facts. DNA collection, interviews, and forms can be discussed with distance and technical language. Personal relationships cannot. They involve emotions, power dynamics, memory, and perspective areas where statements are more easily challenged, contradicted, or reinterpreted. From a communication and image control standpoint, it makes sense that this is where Daniel becomes cautious. Talking about a relationship in detail opens the door to competing accounts, subjective interpretations, and statements that cannot be verified through documents or procedures. In other words, this topic carries reputational risk that procedural topics do not. Avoidance here may be less about hiding facts and more about avoiding an unmanageable narrative space. The mismatch with the total transparency image. This is where public perception becomes divided. Daniel's overall interview message emphasizes openness, voluntary cooperation, repeated offers to assist, willingness to answer questions. Against that backdrop, the refusal to discuss the relationship creates a mismatch. Some viewers interpret this boundary as reasonable. Personal relationships are private, and in a case already surrounded by speculation, refusing to discuss intimate dynamics can be seen as self-protection or respect for privacy, especially when other people involved are not present to respond. Other viewers see the same moment as selective transparency. They notice that Daniel is willing to explain procedures in great detail, but withdraws when the topic becomes relational rather than technical. To them, this selective openness feels inconsistent with the image of full transparency he promotes elsewhere. Importantly, both interpretations can coexist without either being provably correct. The interview itself does not resolve that tension. Neutral analysis: what the interview does and does not establish. Staying strictly within the content of the interview, several points can be stated clearly. Daniel denies all allegations of emotional abuse, phone control, and isolation. He offers a brief counter-explanation regarding phone access, framing it as mutual. He refuses to describe the relationship in detail or discuss it further. The interview does not include independent corroboration of either side's claims. The interviewer does not press beyond the stated boundary. That last point is crucial. The conversation moves on. There is no confrontation, no follow-up, and no attempt to reconcile conflicting accounts within the interview itself. As a result, this segment functions less as an investigation and more as a record of how Daniel chooses to respond publicly when these issues are raised. Media strategy and reputation management. From a media analysis perspective, this section can be viewed through the lens of image management rather than truth determination. Daniel does three things at once. He rejects the allegations clearly enough to avoid silence being interpreted as admission. He limits exposure by refusing deeper discussion. He avoids language that could escalate conflict or provoke emotional responses. This is a common strategy in high-profile cases. Deny, reframe briefly, then disengage. It reduces the risk of saying something that could be taken out of context or reinterpreted later. It also keeps the focus on areas where the speaker feels more confident and prepared, namely, interactions with law enforcement. Again, this strategy does not tell us whether the allegations are accurate or not. It tells us how Daniel manages topics that are harder to control in public discourse. Why this section is especially sensitive for audiences. Allegations involving emotional harm and control tend to provoke strong reactions. Viewers often bring their own experiences, values, and assumptions into how they interpret these moments. That makes neutrality especially important. The interview does not provide enough information to confirm or dismiss the claims. It provides only Daniel's response and his boundary. Responsible analysis, therefore, focuses not on judging the relationship, but on examining how the conversation is handled. This is also why speculation becomes risky here. Filling in gaps about personal dynamics without verified information can quickly cross from analysis into assumption. The most grounded approach is to observe the communication choices themselves. The role of Malehya in this segment. Malehya appears in this part of the interview primarily through allegations attributed to others. She does not speak directly, and her perspective is not presented in full. Daniel's refusal to discuss the relationship further means that the audience is left with an incomplete picture from both sides. That imbalance reinforces the need for caution. Without direct, on-the-record accounts from all parties, any attempt to draw conclusions about relationship dynamics would go beyond what the interview supports. From an analytical standpoint, Malehya's role here is less about character judgment and more about how her absence from the conversation shapes its limits. Why this segment matters in the broader interview. This section is important not because it answers questions, but because it shows where answers stop. It marks the boundary between what Daniel is willing to discuss openly and what he considers off-limits. In the broader structure of the interview, that boundary is revealing. It highlights the difference between procedural transparency and personal opacity. It also helps explain why public reactions vary so widely. People respond not only to what is said, but the what is avoided. Ultimately, this segment contributes to the overall complexity of the interview. It does not resolve allegations. It does not validate them. What it does is illustrate how, in a highly scrutinized case, communication choices themselves become part of the story. Understanding that distinction allows viewers to remain grounded, avoid speculation, and recognize the limits of what this interview can realistically tell us, especially when it comes to deeply personal matters that extend beyond documents, procedures, and formal statements. Denials of drugs and rumors. Defensive reaction or preemptive positioning. In this section of the interview, Daniel Martell spends a notable amount of time addressing allegations that were not fully laid out by the interviewer in question form. He firmly denies any involvement with illegal substances, rejects claims of debt or financial pressure linked to such activity, and dismisses rumors about late-night gatherings, distribution, or production of prohibited materials. The length and intensity of these denials stand out, not because they introduce new evidence, but because of how proactively they are delivered. This part of the interview offers a clear example of what is often referred to in communication analysis as preemptive defense, responding not only to what is asked, but to what the speaker believes the audience is already thinking. The disproportionate weight of the denial. One of the first things that becomes apparent is the imbalance between the question and the response. The interviewer asks generally about accusations and rumors related to substance use. Daniel's answer, however, expands far beyond that prompt. He does not simply say he did not use drugs. He goes further, listing multiple related possibilities and rejecting each one in turn. No possession, no paraphernalia, no debts, no involvement with dealers, no production, no distribution, no parties, no unexplained movements. This expansion is important. It results in a denial that feels comprehensive, almost rehearsed, as if it is meant to cover every version of the rumor at once. From a logical standpoint, this does not indicate guilt or innocence. It indicates awareness. Daniel clearly understands how wide-ranging and detailed the public speculation has become. Speaking to the audience, not just the interviewer. At this moment in the interview, Daniel appears less focused on answering a journalist and more focused on addressing an invisible third party, the online audience. His language suggests he is responding to what he has read, seen, or heard circulating beyond the interview itself. This shift matters because it changes the function of the conversation. Instead of a question and answer exchange, this becomes a reputational statement. He is not only correcting a claim, he is attempting to shut down an entire category of suspicion by naming it, expanding it, and then rejecting it. This approach can be effective in public communication. By confronting rumors directly, a speaker can reduce their power. However, it can also draw additional attention to those rumors, especially when they are described in detail. The interview walks that line. The role of law enforcement references. Daniel repeatedly emphasizes that investigators found nothing related to illegal substances at the home and that no charges were brought. He frames this as confirmation that the rumors lack substance. This argument relies on a straightforward logic. If wrongdoing existed, authorities would have acted. From a narrative standpoint, referencing law enforcement decisions adds weight to his denial. It positions him as someone who has already been scrutinized and cleared in this specific area. However, it is important to note that the interview does not provide independent confirmation of investigative scope or findings. Viewers are again relying on Daniel's account of what authorities did or did not discover. This does not invalidate his claim, but it highlights the pattern seen throughout the interview. Official processes are frequently cited, but always filtered through his perspective. Why preemptive defense makes sense in this context. In high-profile cases, rumors often grow faster than verified information. Social media speculation can attach motives, backstories, and narratives that take on a life of their own. Daniel appears to recognize this environment clearly. His denials suggest he is not only reacting to direct accusations, but attempting to cut off future lines of speculation before they gain further traction. This is the essence of preemptive defense. Instead of waiting for each allegation to surface formally, the speaker addresses them all at once. In theory, this can stabilize public perception. In practice, it can also signal how deeply the speaker is tracking public opinion. The key analytical point here is not whether his denials are true or false, but why he chooses to present them in this way, at this moment, and in this format. Emotional tone and language choice. Daniel's tone in this segment becomes firmer and more emphatic. He uses absolute language, rejecting each claim without qualification. There is little nuance. No, to my knowledge. No, as far as I'm aware. The certainty is complete. This emotional firmness contrasts with earlier parts of the interview, where he carefully explains procedures and acknowledges limitations in what he can share. Here, there are no limitations. The message is simple and total. None of it happened. For some viewers, this confidence reads as sincerity. For others, it may feel defensive. The interview itself does not resolve that perception gap, but it does create it. Rumors as a narrative threat. From a media analysis perspective, rumors about illegal substances carry a specific kind of narrative risk. They suggest motive, chaos, hidden pressures, and secret behaviors. Even without evidence, such rumors can reshape how audiences interpret timelines and decisions. Daniel's extended denial can therefore be understood as an attempt to remove an entire explanatory framework from the discussion. If there were no substances, no debts, and no secret activity, then certain speculative explanations lose their foundation. This is a strategic move. By eliminating one broad category of speculation, Daniel attempts to narrow the field of interpretation back toward his preferred framing of the case. The absence of follow-up and its effect. Notably, the interviewer does not push back or ask for clarification in this section. There is no request for timelines, no comparison with other accounts, and no probing of inconsistencies. The denial stands on its own, and the conversation moves forward. This lack of follow-up contributes to the effectiveness of the preemptive defense. Without challenge, the statement remains intact, untested, and unresolved. For viewers, this can either reinforce trust or leave lingering questions, depending on their prior assumptions. What this segment tells us about Daniel's media awareness. Taken as a whole, this part of the interview shows that Daniel is acutely aware of the narratives circulating about him. He is not only responding to the investigation, but to the public conversation surrounding it. His denials are shaped by that awareness. This does not mean he is manipulating the truth. It means he understands the environment he is speaking into. In that sense, this segment is less about substance allegations themselves and more about how a central figure navigates. Widespread rumor in real time. Responsible takeaway. Staying grounded in what the interview actually provides. Several conclusions can be drawn responsibly. Daniel explicitly denies all rumors related to illegal substances and associated behavior. He expands his denial beyond the immediate question, addressing multiple variations of the rumor at once. This suggests strong awareness of public suspicion and online speculation. The denials function as preemptive defense rather than reactive clarification. The interview does not independently verify or challenge these claims. In the broader structure of the interview, this section reinforces a pattern already seen. Daniel actively shapes how topics are framed, anticipates suspicion, and attempts to control interpretation before it fully forms. Whether viewers see this as reasonable self-defense or calculated image management depends largely on their existing perspective. What can be said with certainty is that this segment plays a significant role in how the interview addresses rumor, reputation, and public pressure without resolving the deeper questions that continue to surround the case. attitude toward the true crime community and reported threats, public conflict, personal impact, and narrative control. In the final stretch of the interview, the focus shifts away from procedures, evidence, and timelines, and toward something far less technical but equally influential: Daniel Martell's relationship with the online true crime community and the broader social media environments surrounding the case. His language here becomes noticeably sharper. He describes parts of the true crime space as obsessive, aggressive, and personally harmful, and he confirms that he receives threats on a regular basis, with law enforcement aware and involved. This section stands apart from the rest of the interview because it moves the conversation from facts and processes into the realm of public conflict. It raises questions not only about how the case is discussed online, but also about how that discussion feeds back into the people directly connected to the story. Framing the true crime community as a source of harm, Daniel characterizes certain segments of the true crime community using strong language. He portrays it as fixated, hostile, and destructive, rather than investigative or informative. According to his account, online creators and commenters have gone beyond discussing the case and have become personally focused on him, repeating accusations and fueling narratives that he believes are false. From a communication analysis perspective, this framing serves a clear purpose. It shifts the focus away from the content of the accusations and toward the behavior of those making them. Instead of debating claims one by one, Daniel reframes the problem as systemic. The environment itself is flawed, excessive, and harmful. This is a powerful rhetorical move. By questioning the legitimacy of the space in which accusations circulate, he indirectly questions the credibility of the accusations themselves without having to address each one directly. Obsession versus accountability, a deliberate contrast. Daniel repeatedly uses language that suggests imbalance. He portrays himself as living his life under constant scrutiny, while describing online commentators as consumed by theories and speculation. This contrast creates a moral divide. On one side, an individual dealing with loss and pressure. On the other, an online crowd driven by fixation rather than responsibility. For some viewers, this contrast resonates. The true crime genre has increasingly faced criticism for blurring the line between analysis and harassment. In that context, Daniel's comments may feel like a legitimate critique of how certain communities operate. For other viewers, however, this framing raises a different concern. They may question whether labeling critics as obsessive or vicious is also a way to delegitimize scrutiny entirely. This dual interpretation is what makes the segment so divisive. The confirmation of ongoing threats. One of the most serious claims Daniel makes in this section is that he receives threats on a daily basis and that authorities are aware of them. He states that investigators have informed him about these threats and that steps are being taken to address the situation. This claim significantly raises the emotional stakes of the interview. Threats, regardless of context, represent a real-world escalation beyond online debate. By introducing this element, Daniel positions himself not just as someone under criticism, but as someone under direct personal pressure. At the same time, the interview does not provide detail about the nature, source, or verification of these threats. That absence is important. The claim stands as part of Daniel's account, not as independently examined evidence within the interview itself. Psychological impact as a narrative element. Daniel describes how the volume and persistence of online commentary affected him over time. He says that initially it did not bother him, but as the scale grew, thousands of comments, repeated accusations, it became overwhelming. Eventually, he reduced his engagement, stepping back from responding publicly. This progression is psychologically plausible. Continuous scrutiny, especially in emotionally charged cases, can have cumulative effects. From an analytical standpoint, this section highlights how online discourse can become a secondary pressure layered on top of an already stressful situation. Importantly, Daniel does not present himself as fearful. He downplays the personal impact of the threats, suggesting he is not easily shaken. This creates an interesting contrast. Acknowledgement of seriousness paired with a projection of resilience. That balance may be intended to convey strength, or to avoid appearing vulnerable, or both. Silence as fuel. The feedback loop he describes. Daniel suggests that his reduced online presence has actually worsened the situation, leading to more extreme theories and increased hostility. This idea points to a feedback loop common in digital spaces. Silence is often interpreted as confirmation, which then fuels further speculation. From a media analysis perspective, this is a critical observation. When central figures disengage, the narrative does not stop. It is instead shaped by those who remain active. Daniel appears to recognize this, but also implies that engagement itself became unsustainable. This dilemma: speak and risk escalation, or stay silent and invite speculation, is one that many people connected to high-profile cases face. The interview does not resolve it, but it illustrates how no option feels neutral once a story reaches a certain level of public attention. Victim of harassment or manager of narrative. This is where the core analytical tension emerges. On one hand, Daniel presents himself as someone targeted by excessive, hostile online behavior. On the other hand, throughout the interview, he demonstrates strong awareness of public narratives and actively works to shape them. These two positions are not mutually exclusive. A person can be under genuine harassment while also engaging in image management. However, the overlap complicates how audiences interpret his statements. Some viewers may see him primarily as a victim of an out-of-control online culture, unfairly judged and attacked without evidence. Others may see his critique of the true crime community as an attempt to regain control of the narrative by discrediting alternative voices. The interview itself does not answer which interpretation is more accurate. It simply presents Daniel's perspective, leaving viewers to weigh it against their own understanding of the case and of online true crime culture. True crime and the question of boundaries. This segment naturally opens a broader discussion about the limits of true crime as a genre. When does analysis turn into intrusion? When does public interest become personal harm? Daniel's comments reflect concerns that have been raised far beyond this case, as true crime content has grown in scale and influence. By including this discussion, the interview moves beyond the specific facts of the disappearance and into a cultural critique. Whether viewers agree with Daniel or not, the issue he raises is real. Online communities can amplify suspicion, repeat unverified claims, and create intense pressure on individuals connected to unresolved cases. At the same time, true crime audiences often argue that public discussion keeps cases visible and can contribute to accountability. This tension between visibility and harm is exactly what this segment brings into focus. Law enforcement as a stabilizing reference point. As in other parts of the interview, Daniel references law enforcement as an external authority. By stating that police are aware of the threats and are addressing them, he reinforces the idea that his concerns are not merely emotional reactions, but matters taken seriously by institutions. This serves two functions. It legitimizes his claim of being targeted. It aligns him once again with official structures, reinforcing the image of cooperation and credibility. However, as elsewhere, these references are not expanded upon within the interview. Viewers are asked to accept them as reported. Why this section matters for the overall interview. This final segment reframes the entire conversation. Up to this point, the interview has focused on what happened, what procedures were followed, and how Daniel interprets those actions. Here, the focus becomes how the story itself is being told, shared, and contested. By ending on this note, the interview positions the true crime community not just as observers, but as active participants in the case's public life. Daniel presents himself as responding not only to investigators, but to an audience that he believes has crossed important boundaries. Whether viewers see this as justified criticism or strategic deflection, the impact is the same. It complicates the narrative. The case is no longer just about missing children. It is also about who gets to speak, who is believed, and how public attention is wielded. Grounded takeaway. Based strictly on the interview, several points can be stated without speculation. Daniel describes parts of the true crime community as aggressive and harmful. He claims to receive ongoing threats and says authorities are aware. He links increased hostility to his reduced online engagement. This segment highlights a direct conflict between a central figure in the case and online media culture. The interview raises, but does not resolve, the question of whether Daniel is primarily a target of harassment or an active manager of public perception. Ultimately, this section underscores how unresolved cases now exist in two parallel spaces: the official investigation and the online narrative. Daniel's comments draw attention to the strain between those spaces and to the real-world consequences that can arise when that strain intensifies. Understanding this dynamic does not require taking sides. It requires recognizing that in modern cases, the story is not only what happened, but how the story is told, repeated, and contested in public. As we've seen throughout this interview, what Daniel Martell says, and just as importantly, how he says it adds new layers to an already complex and unresolved case. From claims of cooperation and key procedural details, to moments of avoidance, narrative framing, and direct conflict with online communities, this interview does not provide final answers. Instead, it highlights how much remains unclear, contested, and open to interpretation. What matters most, however, is not public opinion or online debate, but the unanswered question at the center of it all. What truly happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan? Until verified facts emerge and the investigation reaches a conclusion, every statement should be approached carefully, critically, and responsibly. At True Child Cases, our goal is not to speculate or sensationalize, but to break down information logically, separate claims from confirmed facts, and help viewers understand the full context behind the headlines. If you value calm, evidence-based analysis, and want to stay informed as this case continues to develop, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching and for approaching this case with thoughtfulness and respect. We will continue to follow the investigation closely and bring you updates and analysis as new information becomes available.